Where are you tuning in from right now, and what time is it as you listen to this? When the video ends, don't forget to leave a comment and share your thoughts so we can continue digging into the hidden corners of the past together. Your presence here right now is the very first piece of the puzzle as we begin to crack open one of the darkest files in modern history. Because today's case begins with a midnight escape. Two traitors carrying the atomic secrets of the West slipping right through the net of MI5. But the most shocking detail isn't their getaway, it's their sanctuary, the private flat of Victor Rothschild. He was a highly decorated war hero and the heir to the most powerful financial dynasty on Earth. Was he merely a naive aristocrat exploited by his friends? Or was he in fact the most ruthless spymaster of the 20th century? The 25th of May, 1951, fell on a Friday. It was a date that would permanently fracture the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, severely damaging the myth of British intelligence superiority. In the late hours of the evening, Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean abandoned their lives in London, drove rapidly to the coastal town of Southampton, and purchased 2 tickets for the SS Falaise, a ferry bound for St. Malo, France. They left their rented car on the docks, leaving behind their coats, their luggage, and their allegiances. From France, they would move through an established underground network, crossing the continent until they vanished behind the Iron Curtain, resurfacing only years later in Moscow. This was not a spontaneous flight. It was a meticulously calculated extraction orchestrated by the KGB, executed mere hours before MI5 was scheduled to bring Donald Maclean in for interrogation. The timing of their disappearance indicated a catastrophic internal leak. The defectors were the absolute embodiment of the British ruling class. Donald Maclean was the son of a former cabinet minister, a highly polished diplomat who had served as the first secretary at the British Embassy in Washington. In that role, Maclean held a permanent pass to the United States Atomic Energy Commission. He sat in on the most sensitive discussions regarding the nuclear capabilities of the West, the production rates of fissile material, and the strategic bombing plans of the Truman administration. Every document he read, every projection he analyzed, was systematically copied and handed over to his Soviet handlers. Guy Burgess was equally entrenched in the establishment, though entirely different in disposition. Educated at Eton and Trinity College, Cambridge, Burgess was a brilliant but volatile intelligence officer and diplomat. He had worked for MI6, the BBC, and the Foreign Office. He possessed an uncanny ability to cultivate relationships with politicians, intelligence chiefs, and foreign dignitaries, absorbing their secrets during long, alcohol-fueled conversations. Burgess had access to high-level diplomatic cables and strategic assessments, functioning as a human vacuum cleaner for classified information, which he routinely passed to Moscow. The public shock was absolute. When the news of the disappearance broke, the British populace was forced to confront a reality that contradicted their most fundamental societal beliefs. The British populace was forced to confront a reality that contradicted their most fundamental societal beliefs. Treason now wore a tailored suit, spoke with a refined upper-class accent, and held membership in the exclusive gentlemen's clubs of St. James's. The realization that men of such immense privilege, men who had been granted the highest levels of trust the state could offer, had spent over a decade systematically betraying their country to a hostile foreign power was deeply destabilizing. The British establishment was paralyzed, forced to look inward and ask how many others among their ranks were harboring similar loyalties. In Washington, the initial reports triggered unadulterated fury. The CIA and the FBI had already been highly suspicious of British security standards. The defections confirmed their worst fears. The British intelligence apparatus was severely compromised. The United States immediately restricted intelligence sharing, deeply damaging the special relationship at a time when the Korean War was raging and the threat of Soviet expansionism was at its peak. Back in London, MI5 headquarters descended into a state of frantic, aggressive panic. The immediate priority was damage control. Investigators were dispatched to tear through the personal effects, the address books, and the financial records of the defectors. They needed to trace every movement, every phone call, and every known associate of Burgess and McLean to determine the extent of the Soviet network operating within the government. They were hunting for the source of the leak, the individual who had warned the defectors that the net was closing in. As MI5 agents painstakingly reconstructed the social web of Guy Burgess, they waded through a list of prominent politicians, journalists, and artists. Burgess was notoriously gregarious. His network was vast and chaotic. But as they cross-referenced his housing records, financial transactions, and deepest personal ties, one name repeatedly surfaced, standing out with a glaring, uncomfortable prominence. It was a name that carried a weight few could challenge, a name synonymous with limitless wealth and historical power. Victor Rothschild. Nathaniel Mayer Victor Rothschild was the third Baron Rothschild. He was not merely a wealthy heir. He was a highly respected zoologist, an active member of the House of Lords, and a man who possessed an intellect as formidable as his bank account. More crucially for the investigators staring at his name in the Burgess files, Victor Rothschild was one of their own. During the Second World War, he had served as a senior officer in MI5, specializing in counter-sabotage. He was a decorated hero who had risked his life dismantling live German explosives. The investigators were forced to document a highly disturbing set of facts. Victor Rothschild was not just an acquaintance of the defectors. He was an intimate, trusted friend of Guy Burgess, a relationship forged years earlier in the intellectual crucibles of Cambridge University. Their bond had survived the intervening decades, maintaining a steady course through the turmoil of the war and the shifting political landscape of the post-war era. The most damning piece of physical evidence linking the Baron to the traitor was a property contract. As MI5 traced Burgess's movements over the previous decade, they focused heavily on a specific address, number 5 Bentink Street, located in the affluent Marylebone district of central London. During the most critical years of the Second World War, Guy Burgess had lived at this address. The property was owned by the Rothschild family. Victor Rothschild himself had held the lease, and when he married and sought a quieter residence, he had sublet the property to his close friend, Guy Burgess, for a nominal fee. By handing over the keys to Bentink Street, Victor Rothschild had inadvertently, or perhaps intentionally, provided a secure operating base for Soviet espionage right in the center of the British capital. The investigators realized with a profound sense of dread that they were not just looking at a social connection. They were looking at the physical infrastructure of a spy ring, facilitated by one of the wealthiest men in the empire. The realization sent a shockwave through the upper echelons of British intelligence. The rules of investigation changed when a Rothschild was involved. This was a man whose family had financed the British government during times of crisis, a man whose social circle included prime ministers and royalty. Accusing him or even formally investigating him carried immense political risk. Yet, the facts were rigid and unforgiving. The man who had fled to Moscow with the most sensitive secrets of the British state had spent years living under the direct patronage of a baron who was simultaneously working for the very intelligence agency tasked with catching foreign spies. The contradiction was absolute. MI5 was forced to launch a deeply sensitive, highly classified inquiry into the life of Victor Rothschild. They had to determine exactly what transpired within the walls of the Bentink Street flat, and whether the genius scientist who had protected Britain from German bombs was, in fact, the silent architect of its Cold War downfall. The address itself, number 5 Bentink Street, sat quietly in the affluent heart of Marylebone. During the early 1940s, as the Luftwaffe relentlessly pounded London into jagged concrete and ash, this particular townhouse became a heavily fortified sanctuary for an entirely different kind of destruction. The city outside was subjected to the daily terror of the Blitz. Sirens wailed, searchlights slashed across the night sky, and the heavy thud of high explosives reduced entire city blocks to rubble. The population lived in a state of suspended dread, taking shelter in damp underground stations and enforcing strict blackouts to deny German bombers their targets. Yet behind the heavy blackout curtains of Victor Rothschild's property, a surreal and highly insulated reality took shape. Victor had recently married Theresa Mayer, seeking a more private, conventional domestic life away from the relentless intensity of wartime London. He vacated the Bentink Street flat. He passed the lease at a remarkably low rent to Guy Burgess. It was an act of aristocratic generosity toward a close university friend. Almost immediately, Burgess invited another Cambridge contemporary to share the sprawling space. Anthony Blunt. Blunt was a man of extreme polish and sharp intellect, an esteemed art historian who would later become the surveyor of the King's pictures. He was also an active officer in MI5. Together, Burgess and Blunt transformed the Rothschild property into the operational nerve center for Soviet espionage in the United Kingdom. Two of Moscow's most valuable assets were now securely housed under a roof owned by one of Britain's most prominent domestic intelligence officers. The atmosphere they cultivated inside the flat was a masterpiece of strategic misdirection. Burgess was wildly eccentric, a heavy drinker who subsisted on a diet of garlic, raw onions, and immense quantities of alcohol. He was aggressively unkempt, prone to leaving half-eaten food, overflowing ashtrays, and soiled clothing scattered across the expensive furniture. More importantly, Burgess was openly homosexual at a time when British law punished such acts with severe imprisonment and absolute social ruin. He weaponized his chaotic personal life, turning the flat into what contemporaries later described as a high-class disorderly house. The property became infamous within a select, highly privileged circle. It was a hub of continuous, frenetic partying. The rooms were constantly filled with a heavy haze of cigarette smoke and the sharp scent of spilled gin and whiskey. Young aristocrats, bohemian artists, and government officials moved through the flat at all hours, engaging in illicit sexual encounters and drunken debates. The sheer volume of scandal generated by the household was its greatest defense mechanism. The police and domestic security services, rigidly bound by the class prejudices of the era, viewed the Bentink Street address simply as a den of eccentric upper-class hedonists. They were entirely disarmed by the open debauchery. The British establishment fundamentally believed that a Soviet spy would be a grim, disciplined fanatic in a trench coat, not a flamboyant, drunken aristocrat hosting raucous parties in Marylebone. The chaos was the perfect camouflage. The guest list elevated this camouflage into a realm of breathtaking audacity. The men who drank on the sofas of Bentink Street were not marginalized outsiders. They were the very architects of the British state. The most frequent visitor was Guy Liddell, the deputy director of MI5. Liddell was the man directly responsible for identifying and neutralizing foreign threats to the British Empire. Exhausted from managing the nation's security apparatus during a world war, Liddell would leave his office and head straight to Burgess's flat to unwind. He sat in the living room, drinking heavily and gossiping about the internal politics of the intelligence services, entirely unaware that his hosts were actively memorizing every word he spoke. The flat also functioned as a radical political salon. It hosted prominent left-wing intellectuals like the brilliant physicist J.D. Bernal and the labor politician John Strachey. Amidst the clinking of glasses and the wail of jazz records, these men engaged in fierce ideological debates. They openly praised the scientific socialism of the Soviet Union and leveled scathing critiques at the failures of the British government. Because these conversations took place within the insulated, privileged walls of a Rothschild property, MI5 dismissed them. The intelligence services categorized the subversive rhetoric as the harmless academic posturing of brilliant but eccentric young men. They failed to recognize that the rhetoric was not academic at all. It was a statement of operational intent. Beneath the veneer of bohemian success, a lethal and highly efficient intelligence operation ran with terrifying precision. During the daylight hours, the spies seamlessly integrated into the machinery of the British war effort. Burgess walked the halls of the Foreign Office, while Blunt operated deep within MI5. Both men possessed high-level security clearances, granting them unfettered access to the most sensitive secrets of the Allied war machine. They handled diplomatic cables detailing post-war negotiations, military assessments of German troop movements, and the highly guarded summaries of intercepted communications. When evening fell, the operation shifted to Bentink Street. Burgess and Blunt routinely smuggled heavily classified files out of their respective offices, stuffing them into briefcases or simply under their coats. While the living room hosted loud, drunken arguments and the phonograph masked any suspicious noise, the two men retreated to a locked back room. There, under the harsh glare of a single desk lamp, they methodically photographed the stolen documents. They processed rolls of film containing the strategic lifeblood of the British Empire. Once the photography was complete, they ventured out into the pitch-black, bombed-out streets of London to hand the film directly to their KGB control officers, who waited in the shadows of parks and alleyways. The sheer arrogance of the operation bordered on the suicidal. Burgess and Blunt were often severely intoxicated while handling state secrets. They were shockingly careless, sometimes leaving top-secret Foreign Office folders resting on the dining table among empty wine bottles. On at least one occasion, heavily classified documents were dropped directly onto the floor during a drunken gathering. Any ordinary citizen would have been arrested, interrogated, and likely executed for such an egregious breach of national security. Yet, shielded by the aristocratic reputation of their landlord and the protective bubble of their own social class, no guest ever reported them. The establishment protected its own, and the spies ruthlessly exploited that deeply ingrained institutional bias. The most perplexing and debated element of the Bentink Street operation was the continued presence of the landlord himself. Victor Rothschild did not simply hand over the keys and vanish into domestic life. He remained a frequent, visible presence at the flat. He regularly dropped in to share a drink, check on his property, and socialize with his old Cambridge friends. Victor was not a detached aristocrat ignorant of the realities of war. He was a highly trained intelligence officer. As the head of MI5's counter-sabotage unit, his entire professional existence was dedicated to identifying anomalies, detecting hidden threats, and dismantling covert enemy operations. He possessed one of the most analytical, rigorously trained minds in the country. Years later, when the true nature of the Bentink Street flat was exposed to a horrified public, Victor fiercely defended his innocence. He insisted that he was entirely blind to the espionage occurring within his own walls. He claimed he saw exactly what the rest of the British establishment saw: a messy, chaotic apartment inhabited by a brilliantly eccentric but harmless friend. He maintained that his affection for Burgess blinded him to the dark reality of the situation. This defense forced historians, intelligence analysts, and the British public to grapple with a deeply uncomfortable paradox. If Victor Rothschild was telling the truth, it meant that one of the most brilliant scientific minds in MI5, a man entrusted with defusing highly sophisticated Nazi bombs, was incredibly, almost pathologically naive. It meant that Soviet spies operated a massive intelligence clearinghouse directly in front of him, leaving classified documents on his furniture, and he simply failed to notice. The alternative explanation was far more sinister, casting a long, dark shadow over the legacy of the Rothschild dynasty. The alternative suggested that Victor Rothschild was not blind at all. It proposed that he was the ultimate silent partner, a dark patron who deliberately utilized his immense wealth, his unassailable social standing, and his position within MI5 to construct an impenetrable fortress for his friends. By lending them his property and his prestige, he provided a safe house that no ordinary police officer or security agent would ever dare to raid. The true nature of Victor's involvement at number 5, Bentink Street, remains locked away in redacted files and the silent graves of the men who drank there, leaving a permanent stain of suspicion on the man who claimed to serve the crown. The infection began decades earlier, far from the bomb-shattered streets of 1940s London, behind the heavy oak doors and ancient stone walls of Trinity College, Cambridge. During the early 1930s, here, the groundwork for the greatest intelligence catastrophe in British history was laid in a place of pristine isolation and absolute privilege. Cambridge in that era was a world entirely disconnected from the grinding reality of the British working class. Outside the manicured lawns of the university, the Great Depression was ravaging the global economy. Bread lines stretched through industrial cities, shipyards sat rusting and silent, and millions of men were stripped of their livelihoods. Across the English Channel, the political landscape was shifting violently. Fascism was surging in Italy, and Adolf Hitler was consolidating his brutal grip on Germany. Yet, inside the dining halls of Cambridge, young men in tailored evening wear drank vintage port, ate multi-course meals served by dedicated college staff, and debated the philosophical implications of a collapsing world order. This environment fostered a lethal combination of immense privilege and profound intellectual arrogance. The brightest students at Cambridge looked at the British government and saw an obsolete, crumbling institution entirely incapable of managing the modern crisis. They viewed the conservative politicians in Westminster as cowardly appeasers, men who were too weak to stand up to the rising Nazi threat. In their eyes, the capitalist system had fatally failed, and Western democracy was rapidly approaching its expiration date. They were desperately searching for an alternative, a powerful force capable of crushing fascism and rebuilding a rational society. For the young, impatient elite, the answer was not in London or Washington. The answer was in Moscow. At the absolute epicenter of this intellectual radicalization was a highly secretive, ultra-exclusive society known officially as the Cambridge Conversazione Society, but universally referred to as the Cambridge Apostles. Membership was strictly by invitation, extended only to the men considered to possess the most brilliant minds of their generation. The Apostles operated with a rigid, cult-like belief in their own superiority. They held a fundamental doctrine that the members of the society were the only real people in existence. Everyone else, including the British public and the government, were merely phenomena. This philosophy was not just academic arrogance, it was the psychological prerequisite for treason. The Apostles trained their members to detach themselves entirely from conventional morality and national loyalty. If you are conditioned to believe that you possess a higher intellect than the state, and that the state is morally bankrupt, then betraying your country is no longer a crime. It becomes a moral imperative, a philosophical duty executed by a superior mind. It was into this highly charged, intensely arrogant atmosphere that Victor Rothschild arrived. He was a dominant physical and intellectual presence, a brilliant student of zoology with an insatiable appetite for fast cars, jazz music, and scientific inquiry. But above all, he was a Rothschild. He carried the immense weight of a surname that had financed empires, stabilized European markets, and wielded unmatched political influence for over a century. His family was the very embodiment of global capitalism, the exact system the radicalized students of Cambridge were actively plotting to destroy. Yet Victor was rapidly absorbed into the inner circle of the Apostles. He possessed the raw intellect they demanded, and his immense wealth made him an irresistible center of gravity. He threw lavish parties, drove a Bugatti across the university grounds, and funded the bohemian lifestyles of his poorer, highly radicalized friends. He was surrounded by men like Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, and Kim Philby, men who were already crossing the line from Marxist theory into active Soviet recruitment. The man orchestrating this recruitment was not a foreign agent operating from the shadows. He was a respected Cambridge academic, a sophisticated don named Anthony Blunt. Older, immaculately dressed, and highly regarded as an art historian, Blunt was also a ruthless and efficient talent spotter for the NKVD, the precursor to the KGB. Blunt did not hand out communist manifestos or recruit in crowded public squares. He operated with lethal subtlety. He preyed on the intellectual vanity of the Cambridge elite. He identified the brightest, most socially connected young men, isolated them, and methodically reshaped their worldviews. Blunt understood exactly how to manipulate the aristocracy. He framed Soviet espionage not as a gritty political rebellion, but as a highly exclusive, intellectually superior club. He convinced his targets that serving Stalin was the only true way to fight fascism, and that their elite status in Britain made them the perfect hidden weapons. He was a psychological hunter, mapping out the vulnerabilities, ambitions, and secrets of his students. When Blunt focused his attention on Victor Rothschild, he recognized a highly complex target. He knew that the heir to the Rothschild fortune was unlikely to take orders from a Soviet handler or steal classified documents for a few rubles. Victor was fiercely independent, heavily invested in his own scientific career, and fundamentally tied to the British establishment. Blunt realized that Victor could not be recruited as a foot soldier. He had to be cultivated as an asset. Blunt's strategy was to surround Victor with a carefully constructed cage of friendship and ideological sympathy. He ensured that Victor was constantly in the company of Burgess, MacLean, and himself. They engaged Victor in relentless debates, pushing him to acknowledge the failures of capitalism and the necessity of the Soviet experiment. They did not demand that Victor carry a Communist Party card or swear an oath to Moscow. Instead, they conditioned him to tolerate their radicalism, to view their extremism as an acceptable intellectual position. The manipulation was incredibly precise. Blunt and Burgess utilized Victor's loyalty to his friends against him. They normalized the rhetoric of treason in his presence, making it a daily part of his social life. By the time the Cambridge spies were officially recruited by Soviet intelligence, swearing their allegiance to a foreign power, Victor was deeply embedded in their personal lives. He was paying for their meals, listening to their theories, and fiercely defending their brilliance against outside critics. This period defined the central mystery of Victor Rothschild's life. As he sat in the oak-paneled rooms of Trinity College, watching his closest friends actively align themselves with a hostile foreign intelligence service, what exactly did he know? He later claimed that he viewed their Marxist obsession as a passing university phase, a temporary intellectual rebellion common among the youth. He insisted that he was a man of science, deeply focused on his zoological research, and entirely uninterested in the gritty mechanics of espionage. But Victor Rothschild was not a fool. He was a man of exceptional analytical capability, a mind trained to observe minutiae and draw logical conclusions. The men he was funding and protecting were not simply reading Karl Marx. They were actively meeting with Soviet handlers, taking instructions from Moscow, and preparing to infiltrate the highest levels of the British government. They were altering their public personas, suddenly dropping their loud communist rhetoric and joining conservative institutions on orders from the NKVD to build their covers. It is highly improbable that an observer as sharp as Victor failed to notice this coordinated shift in behavior. The more brutal assessment is that Victor recognized exactly what his friends were becoming, but he chose to look away. He was paralyzed by the unique moral detachment fostered by the apostles. He elevated personal loyalty above national security, believing that his friends, driven by their superior intellects, were operating on a higher moral plane. By refusing to confront them, by continuing to provide them with his money, his property, and his unassailable social protection, Victor transitioned from an innocent bystander to a crucial enabler. The Cambridge years built a lethal foundation. The Soviets did not just recruit a spy ring, they recruited an entire social ecosystem. They acquired men who would penetrate MI5, MI6, and the Foreign Office, and they acquired the silent, powerful patronage of a man who could shield them from the consequences. When the war finally broke out and these young men moved from the university halls into the heavily guarded corridors of London, the trap they had built at Cambridge snapped shut on the British Empire. The abstract, intellectual debates of Cambridge evaporated instantly in September 1939. When Britain declared war on Germany, the wealthy elite faced a choice. Many chose the safety of distant country estates or secured bureaucratic posts far removed from the physical realities of the conflict. Victor Rothschild possessed the financial means to ride out the war anywhere in the world, in absolute luxury and absolute safety. Instead, he walked directly into the center of the inferno. He joined MI5, the domestic security service, and requested placement in one of its most lethal and unforgiving divisions, Section B1C, the unit dedicated exclusively to counter-sabotage and explosives. This was not a desk job managing files or analyzing intercepted cables. Victor was thrust onto the absolute front line of a hidden, terrifying war. The German military intelligence agency, the Abwehr, understood that they could not immediately break the British military, so they sought to break the British populace. They launched a relentless campaign of psychological and physical terror, smuggling highly sophisticated, miniaturized explosive devices into the United Kingdom. The goal was to paralyze the nation's infrastructure and instill a permanent state of paranoia among the civilian population. The Nazi engineers were ruthlessly inventive. They disguised lethal booby traps as ordinary, everyday items. Bombs were built into innocent-looking mail parcels, hidden inside the wooden crates of imported Spanish onions, and most infamously, packed into luxury chocolate boxes, intended to assassinate high-ranking British officials. These devices were not crude, homemade pipe bombs. They utilized delayed action timers, chemical triggers, and anti-tamper mechanisms designed specifically to kill the man attempting to disarm them. Victor Rothschild became the man who stood between these hidden mechanisms and the British public. When a suspected device was located, whether in the hold of a cargo ship, the sorting room of a post office, or the basement of a government building, Victor was the one called to the scene. The work required a chilling degree of cold-blooded composure. There were no Kevlar blast suits, no remote-controlled robots, and no established protocols. Bomb disposal in the early 1940s was an entirely experimental science, paid for in blood. He operated in total isolation, knowing that a single microscopic error in judgment, a slight tremor in his hand, or a miscalculation of a chemical fuse would result in instant vaporization. He dismantled live, highly unstable Nazi explosives using little more than a screwdriver, a set of pliers, and his own formidable intellect. He carefully recorded the mechanisms of each new German device he defeated, utilizing his rigorous scientific training to draft the very first comprehensive bomb disposal manuals. These manuals were immediately distributed to the Royal Engineers and the Navy, establishing the foundation of modern explosive ordnance disposal. His courage was not an isolated incident, it was a sustained daily routine of staring death in the face. For his exceptional repeated acts of bravery, Victor Rothschild was awarded the George Medal in 1944. It is one of the highest civilian honors bestowed by the British Crown, reserved solely for acts of the greatest heroism in circumstances of extreme danger. The man who wore this medal was an undisputed, blood-tested patriot. He had repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice his own life to protect his country from fascism. Alongside his physical warfare, Victor engaged the enemy psychologically. He possessed an innate understanding of deception and manipulation. Recognizing that the war had to be fought in the minds of the enemy as well as on the battlefield, he established a specialized propaganda division within MI5. He partnered with the brilliant, disillusioned writer Arthur Koestler, and together they manufactured highly sophisticated disinformation campaigns. They forged documents, planted demoralizing rumors within German ranks, and actively subverted the Nazi war machine from the inside out. Victor Rothschild was a master of the shadow war. He understood exactly how intelligence agencies operated, how spies lied, and how to spot an anomaly in an adversary's behavior. This mastery makes his subsequent actions entirely inexplicable, framing the central tragic paradox of his life. In the chaotic early days of 1940, MI5 was severely understaffed and desperately overwhelmed by the sheer volume of suspected German espionage. The agency urgently needed to expand its ranks. They needed analysts, linguists, and men capable of handling highly sensitive information. In a fatal moment of expediency, Victor looked to his own social circle. He reached back to his Cambridge days and directly recommended his old, trusted friend, Anthony Blunt, for a position within the British intelligence apparatus. The vetting process for MI5 during this period was fundamentally flawed, built entirely upon the rigid class prejudices of the British establishment. Security clearances were not granted based on rigorous psychological evaluations or exhaustive background checks. They were granted based on bloodlines, school ties, and personal endorsements. The establishment operated on the unwritten rule that gentlemen did not betray their country. When Victor Rothschild submitted Anthony Blunt's name, the door did not just open, it was taken off its hinges. Victor was not merely a respected officer, he was a Rothschild. His surname functioned as a skeleton key that bypassed all standard security protocols. He threw the full crushing weight of his personal credibility, his status as a war hero, and his immense aristocratic power behind Blunt's application. MI5 vetting officers simply looked at the endorsement and approved it. A Rothschild had vouched for him. That was the only background check required. The consequences of this single recommendation altered the entire trajectory of the Cold War. Lifted by Victor's unassailable patronage, Anthony Blunt walked straight into the nerve center of the British security apparatus. He proved to be a highly competent, immensely charming officer, rapidly climbing the internal hierarchy. He specifically attached himself to Guy Liddell, the deputy director, exploiting Liddell's trust to gain access to the most tightly guarded secret seats of the Allied forces. Blunt's ultimate prize was the internal counterintelligence apparatus of MI5 itself. He methodically photographed classified documents, identifying British agents and revealing counter-espionage strategies. Concurrently, another Soviet mole in their broader network, John Cairncross, infiltrated the Ultra Project at Bletchley Park, smuggling decrypted enigma intercepts to Moscow. Together, they ensured Stalin gained unprecedented access to Allied strategic planning and vulnerabilities. The historical irony is stark, bitter, and devastating. At the exact moment Victor Rothschild was lowering himself into muddy craters and dark basements, his hands steady as he cut the wires on German bombs to save British lives, the friend he personally ushered into the intelligence service was sitting comfortably in an office in Mayfair, systematically selling the survival of the nation to Moscow. Victor had built an impenetrable fortress against Nazi sabotage, yet he had personally held the door open for the deadliest Soviet spy in British history. The end of the Second World War did not bring peace to the men who inhabited the upper echelons of British intelligence. It merely shifted the battleground from the skies over London to the silent, paranoid corridors of Whitehall. The defeat of Nazi Germany removed the singular, unifying threat that had temporarily bound the capitalist West and the communist East. Almost immediately, the Iron Curtain descended across Europe. and the temporary alliance fractured into a bitter, high-stakes clandestine war. For the Soviet spies embedded deep within the British establishment, the stakes escalated dramatically. They were no longer stealing secrets from a mutual enemy. They were now actively stealing the survival strategies of their own nation and handing them to a hostile nuclear power. This precarious double life began to unravel with devastating violence in 1951, when Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean vanished into the night, reappearing later in Moscow. The facade of British invulnerability shattered. The defections triggered a catastrophic chain reaction of suspicion and betrayal that would consume the intelligence services for the next 30 years. The British establishment was suddenly forced to confront a terrifying reality. The men they had trusted most, the men who had shared their schools, their clubs, and their bloodlines, were enemy combatants. The immediate aftermath was a bloodbath of interrogations and internal purges. MI5 and MI6 turned their formidable investigative machinery entirely upon themselves. Friendships that had survived the Blitz were destroyed in cold, windowless interrogation rooms. Officers who had worked side by side for a decade were suddenly tailing each other through the streets of London, tapping each other's telephones, and scrutinizing every past conversation for a slip of the tongue. The Old Boys Network, a system built entirely on the absolute, unquestioned loyalty of the aristocracy, collapsed into a state of vicious, paranoid cannibalism. At the center of this collapsing network stood Victor Rothschild. He was the unavoidable common denominator. The investigators mapping the social web of the Soviet spy ring repeatedly hit a dead end at his doorstep. Guy Burgess had lived in his flat. Anthony Blunt had been recruited into MI5 on his personal recommendation. Kim Philby, the most devastating of all the Soviet moles who would later defect in 1963, was a regular fixture in his social circle. Everywhere the investigators looked, they found the immense silent shadow of the Rothschild empire shielding the traitors. Yet, Victor remained untouchable. While lesser men were dismissed, disgraced, or driven to suicide by the relentless pressure of MI5 interrogators, Victor absorbed the suspicion and continued to operate at the highest levels of the British establishment. He transitioned from intelligence work into a highly influential role as a government advisor, maintaining a deep, intricate web of connections across science, finance, and politics. His survival in the face of such overwhelming circumstantial evidence became a source of deep, festering resentment within the intelligence community. Many counterintelligence officers went to their graves absolutely convinced that Victor was a Soviet agent, protected solely by the sheer, unassailable weight of his wealth and his family name. As the decades passed and the original defectors aged in Moscow exile, the public and the press became obsessed with a single, lingering mystery. The defections of Burgess, Maclean, and Philby had been too clean, too perfectly timed. On each occasion, the spies had slipped the net just hours before M5 moved in. This indicated a mathematical necessity. There had to be another man on the inside. There was a highly placed intelligence asset, operating above the operational level of the defectors, who possessed access to the arrest warrants and possessed the authority to issue the warning. The British public became consumed by the hunt for this elusive figure, universally dubbed the Fifth Man. While modern intelligence consensus officially identified John Cairncross as the fifth man of the Cambridge spy ring, alternative, more explosive theories continued to circulate. In 1994, Australian author Roland Perry published a controversial book explicitly and forcefully naming Victor Rothschild as the true fifth man. Perry's accusations went far beyond the theft of diplomatic cables or MI5 organizational charts. He struck at the very core of the Cold War balance of power, alleging that Victor had utilized his elite scientific background to compromise the absolute highest secret of the 20th century, the atomic bomb. During the war, Britain had initiated its own highly classified nuclear weapons program, codenamed Tube Alloys. Victor, as a top-tier scientist with unmatched security clearances, had access to the leading physicists of the era. The accusation proposed that Victor recognized the catastrophic potential of an American and British monopoly on nuclear weapons. Operating under the deeply arrogant, intellectual detachment cultivated during his Cambridge days, he allegedly decided to level the playing field. The theory suggested that Victor systematically gathered the theoretical blueprints, the mathematical calculations, and the engineering specifications for the atomic bomb and funneled them directly to Joseph Stalin. This theory cast Victor not as a mere foot soldier of the KGB, but as an ideological architect of mutually assured destruction. It suggested that a single man, operating from a private estate in England, had independently decided to alter the geopolitical destiny of the human race by handing the capacity for absolute annihilation to the Soviet Union. While the British government aggressively denied these claims and historians fiercely debated the lack of hard documentary evidence, the accusation permanently altered Victor's historical profile. It painted a portrait of a man whose intellect and arrogance had grown so vast that he believed he possessed the moral authority to distribute the power of a dying star. However, even among the hardened intelligence veterans who dismissed the atomic espionage claims as sensationalism, a secondary, equally damning theory took root. This was the theory of the Dark Patron. It proposed that Victor Rothschild did not need to steal documents or operate a dead drop in a London park to commit treason. His crime was one of passive, deliberate facilitation. According to this view, Victor was the financial and social fortress that allowed the Cambridge spy ring to exist. When his friends were on the verge of exposure, when their chaotic lifestyles threatened to draw the attention of the police, Victor utilized the Rothschild influence to shut down the inquiries. He paid off debts, provided safe houses, and leveraged his immense political connections to ensure that men like Burgess and Blunt were never subjected to the standard scrutiny applied to ordinary citizens. He created a zone of absolute immunity around his friends. The Dark Patron theory suggested that Victor's loyalty to his Cambridge circle completely overrode his loyalty to the British state. He watched them systematically dismantle the empire, and instead of stopping them, he handed them the tools and paid the rent. The most compelling evidence of Victor's manipulative brilliance emerged in the 1980s during the twilight of his life. Tired of the relentless whispered accusations circulating in the press and the private clubs of London, Victor executed a tactical maneuver of breathtaking audacity. He reached out to Peter Wright, a deeply bitter, retired MI5 counterintelligence officer living in poverty in Australia. Wright had spent his entire career hunting Soviet moles and firmly believed the British intelligence establishment was still fatally compromised. Victor paid for Wright to travel to England, housed him on his private estate, and provided him with a massive dossier of highly classified internal MI5 information. He bankrolled Wright to write a book. That book, Spycatcher, became an international phenomenon. It tore the veil of secrecy off the British intelligence services, exposing decades of illegal wiretapping, assassination plots, and internal incompetence. But the true genius of the Spycatcher maneuver lay in its central accusation. The book aggressively, relentlessly accused Sir Roger Hollis, the former Director General of MI5, of being the mastermind behind the Soviet infiltration. Victor Rothschild used his immense wealth to publicly finance the destruction of the head of British intelligence. The operation was a masterpiece of misdirection. By pointing the gun at Roger Hollis, Victor entirely shifted the narrative. The global press, the British Parliament, and the intelligence community became consumed by the debate over Hollis. The spotlight swung violently away from the Rothschild estate. Intelligence analysts spent years dissecting the Spycatcher affair, questioning Victor's true motives. Was it the desperate act of an innocent patriot trying to expose the real traitor and clear his own name? Or was it the final, brilliant chess move of a master spy, utilizing his financial empire to frame a dead man and permanently bury the truth of his own treason in a blizzard of media controversy? The answer remained locked behind the impassive, aristocratic gaze of a man who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of the lie. The media firestorm ignited by the spycatcher affair did not burn away the suspicions surrounding Victor Rothschild. Instead, the flames aggressively turned back upon him. By injecting himself into the public debate over Soviet infiltration, Victor inadvertently placed a massive, inescapable spotlight on his own past. The British press, no longer restrained by the deferential attitudes of the wartime era, began to openly hound the aging baron. Journalists camped outside his estates, aggressively digging into the financial records, the old Cambridge associations, and the haunting reality of the Bentink Street flat. By the winter of 1986, the psychological toll on Victor had reached a breaking point. He was 76 years old. The young, fearless intelligence officer who had calmly unscrewed the detonators of German bombs was gone, replaced by an exhausted, deeply embittered man. He had spent his entire life accumulating power, utilizing his towering intellect and his family's infinite resources to control his environment. Yet he found himself entirely powerless against a pervasive, invisible enemy, the Whisper. The suspicion was a slow-acting poison that had saturated his life for 35 years. It was present in the slight hesitations of politicians when he entered a room, the guarded conversations of former MI5 colleagues, and the relentless, barely concealed accusations in Sunday newspaper columns. He realized with a profound and terrifying clarity that if he did not take drastic action, he would go to his grave branded as the man who sold the British Empire to the KGB. Driven by absolute desperation, Victor shattered the fundamental rule of the British aristocracy: never complain and never explain. In December 1986, he bypassed the government back channels he had utilized his entire life and went directly to the public. He drafted an open letter to the Daily Telegraph, a highly respected, conservative newspaper read by the very establishment that was judging him. The letter was raw, direct, and shocking in its vulnerability. A member of the world's most formidable financial dynasty was publicly begging for his reputation. He wrote, "I am not and never have been a Soviet agent." He demanded that the Director General of MI5 state publicly and unequivocally whether the security services possessed any evidence whatsoever of his treason. The publication of this letter sent shockwaves through Westminster. It was a spectacular embarrassment for the government. A decorated war hero, a peer of the realm, and a prominent advisor was openly claiming that the state's intelligence apparatus was waging a silent psychological war against him. The situation demanded an immediate, high-level response. On December 4, 1986, the burden of addressing the Rothschild crisis fell to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Standing before a packed, tense House of Commons, Thatcher delivered a carefully calibrated, legally precise statement. She addressed the murmurs and the conspiracy theories directly. She stated, "I am advised that we have no evidence that he was ever a Soviet agent." It was an official exoneration from the highest political office in the country. Thatcher effectively ordered the British state and the media to stand down. But to a man of Victor's intellect, the specific phrasing offered a hollow comfort. Thatcher did not say he was innocent. She said they had no evidence. In the murky, paranoid world of counterintelligence, the absence of evidence does not prove loyalty. To the most hardened spy hunters, it merely proves the target was a highly skilled professional who knew how to cover his tracks. The Prime Minister's statement stopped the public hemorrhage, but it could not heal the internal wound. Victor Rothschild won the political battle, but the victory brought no peace. The relentless scrutiny had permanently broken his spirit. He retreated entirely from public life, isolating himself within the vast, silent rooms of his properties. The final years of his life were marked by a profound, agonizing loneliness. He was forced to carry the crushing weight of a tragedy he had either orchestrated or failed to prevent. He outlived Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, and Anthony Blunt, but their ghosts dictated the terms of his legacy. When Victor Rothschild died in 1990, the obituaries were deeply conflicted. They listed his scientific achievements, his George Medal, and his philanthropic endeavors. But in every summary of his life, there was an unavoidable asterisk, a lingering paragraph dedicated to Cambridge, the Bentink Street flat, and the Soviet spies who had operated in his shadow. The state funeral he received could not bury the questions. Victor Rothschild's legacy remains a glaring paradox of the Cold War. He was an undisputed war hero who repeatedly risked his life disarming Nazi explosives, yet his wealth and privilege provided an impenetrable fortress for the very spies who dismantled Western intelligence. Whether he was a brilliant patriot fatally blinded by an aristocratic code of friendship, or the silent architect of a devastating espionage network, his story exposes a chilling reality. The most dangerous threats to a nation rarely break through its heavily guarded gates. They are often invited inside, poured a drink, and handed the keys by the very people sworn to protect the house.